Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a very old place, to a very flat river valley where the nights were long. The oil lamps flickered and the clerks had strong opinions about grain. If you haven't already, dim the lights, make yourself comfortable, and let your shoulders drop. We're going to move slowly. We're going to stay soft around the edges. And we're going to talk about kings. Kings who loved temples. Kings who adored rituals. Kings who needed the gods to sign off on absolutely everything, preferably in triplicate. And yes, we're going to talk about sacred prostitution. Or, at least, we're going to talk about what people thought it was, what the kings said it was, and what the tablets stubbornly suggest it actually was. Because in the ancient cities of the Tigris and Euphrates Uruk, your Nippur, Babylon royal power, dressed itself up in incense and mythology. It told stories about cosmic marriages and divine nights, in order to convince everyone, including the king himself, that the crops would grow, the rivers would behave, and the palace wouldn't fall down. There's an image that many people inherit from a certain Greek tourist named Herodotus. He tells us in a tone that suggests he's just heard something scandalous at a very loud dinner party, that in Babylon, every woman had to go to the temple of the goddess, sit and wait, and accept an encounter with the first stranger who tossed a coin, because the goddess demanded it. A compulsory act, once in a lifetime. A state-mandated, divinely supervised cute-out it is. You'll be relieved to know almost certainly not true. Mesopotamian scribes wrote many things. They wrote everything, honestly, because they adored records. More than modern governments adore forms. They wrote about loans and goats. They wrote about love and law. They produced hymns to goddesses that sound like perfume ads, written by a serious poet, and they did not, in any reliable way, record a system where temple officials ran a service that would make even a modern tourist trap blush. But the rumor stuck, because of course it did, Eastavir, said the Greeks. They do it differently. The Greeks were always saying that. It was their favorite hobby. So what did happen? The better question, softly now, is this. How did Mesopotamian kings use the idea of sacred sexuality, call it sacred marriage, call it ritual union, to bind themselves to the gods and, conveniently, to the land? The short answer, they rapped. Their political legitimacy in a lullaby of love songs, fertility symbols, and carefully staged nights where the king, or sometimes only the idea of the king, united with a goddess. It was theater with incense. It was PR with liars. It was devotion with very delicate euphemisms. Let's settle first in Sumer. In Uruk, the old urban giant, the city that loved the goddess Inanna, who later shows up as Ishtar. Inanna was everything you would want in a divine patroness if you believed success required chaos on a leash. She was love and war, fertility and frenzy, the morning star and the evening star, depending on your mood and hers. She had lovers Notably, the shepherd, Dumosi, and those love songs are vivid. They like metaphors, milk and sweetness, gardens, and plucking. We won't, at this hour of the night, pluck anything. We'll just let the metaphors pass by like a calm breeze. Kings learned early that being the beloved of Inanna was essentially a cheat code. If Inanna liked you, people assumed you could win wars and coax barley into obedience. So the city liturgy grew a ritual, the sacred marriage. In its broadest version, a king would symbolically marry the goddess. Sometimes the partner was a high priestess representing Inanna. Sometimes it was a statue and a bedan arrangement convenient for both theology and discretion. Sometimes it was more of a festival with staged scenes, processions, and invocations that suggested intimacy while keeping details behind doors and curtains where gods, and perhaps the more curious cats, could find them. One of the hymns we possess, probably from the city of Isan, speaks of King Idundagan. It describes a New Year festival full of music and offerings, a procession of women devoted to the goddess, and a great ritual climax that implies a union. The language is poetic and ritualistic. Everything is sweet. Everything is pleasant. Everything is a field waiting for rain. Did the king and a priestess physically consummate the rite? Scholars disagree. Some suggest yes, sometimes. Others note that the texts can be read as metaphorical dramatizations. Either way, the point isn't the act, it's the story told around it. The king becomes Dumuzi. Inanna descends, or her presence is invoked. The world is made new again, and the city breathes out in relief, because that's what cities like to do when the calendar says they can. Under the Yor, 3 dynasty imagined Sumerian kings with excellent brick projects and absolutely relentless administrative energy, we get Shulgi, who always sounds like someone who loved his own press releases. Shulgi has hymns in which he's described as the chosen of Inanna, pleasing to her, very favored, very sweet, very everything. Love songs that modern schoolboys copied centuries later, probably with red cheeks and smirks and teachers sighing. The royal point was simple. The king's body and the land's fertility were synchronized. If the king was pleasing in the eyes of the goddess, wheat would kneel politely, herds would increase, and enemies would consider alternative careers. Is this sacred prostitution? Not really. Not in the sense of a temple economic model where sex work funds the divine budget. Instead, what we see is sacred marriage hieros, gamos functioning as royal propaganda and as communal hope. The king still had to collect taxes, naturally, and build canals, because the best marriage in the cosmos could not convince the Euphrates to stop meandering. But the ritual wrapped those very practical chores in a cosmic romance, which is how kings like to see themselves. It's nicer than chief canal repairman. Let's drift more quietly into the role of priestesses. There were many kinds. Words are tricky, and the translations have a history that makes philologists mutter into their tea. One term, often translated in older books as sacred prostitute, is kadista, literally a holy woman, which is not the same as sex worker. Another group, the Nadru of Sippar and elsewhere, were women dedicated to the god Shamash. They lived in special compounds, legally independent, handling property and loans, lending money at interest, and making bankers everywhere feel seen across 4,000 years. Most were celibate. They were not sleeping with temple visitors. They were sleeping with account ledgers. Queens and royal daughters could be priestesses too. And this is where the personal meets the political rather neatly, as it usually does. Sargon of Akkadi, of the empire, the model conqueror, the man who probably gave every scribe a headache, appointed his daughter Enheduanna as high priestess of Nana. The moon god at Enheduanna is famous, and deservedly so, for her hymns, especially to Inanna. When political trouble came, because it always Dushi was expelled during a local takeover, her poems describe this with heartbreaking calm and with a kind of stubborn dignity. Then celebrate her restoration, she wrote, about the goddess as the force that set her back in place. It's theological, it's political, it's also, in its way, a family drama. Royal daughter exiled, then returned. Because the goddesses love a plot twist, and because empires dislike losing their best public relations officer, if you're hearing the faint chime of a pattern, you're right. Kings used priesthoods, including the highest female priesthoods, to lock in loyalties. A royal daughter, as in priestess, was not a romantic choice. It was infrastructure. It made the city feel seen by the crown. It turned the temple into a family affair, which is how dynasties keep things tidy until, inevitably, they don't. In the later Old Babylonian period and beyond, the sacred marriage ritual continued to exist in memory, in hymns, and perhaps in acts. But we also see a subtle shift. In Babylon, the Great Spring Festival, the Akichu, focuses on Marduk, the city's chief god, and the king's yearly refresh of authority. Here, the ritual union is less obvious, and the king's main performance is not amorous. It is humiliating, because apparently nothing says you still have divine approval like getting ceremonially slapped by the chief priest. In one part of the festival, the king enters the temple, confesses he has not oppressed his people, a likely story, and the priest slaps him. If tears appear, the gods approve. If they don't, well, the records do not tell us what happens if the king remains dry-eyed. It's possible everyone pretends not to notice, because empires thrive on broadly shared polite fictions. Herodotus, always ready for a good anecdote, says that at the top of the ziggurat in Babylon, there was a room with a bed and a golden table. A woman chosen by the god, of course, slept there, waiting for the deity to visit. He might be misinformed. He usually is, when it's too interesting. But Mesopotamian temples did prepare beds for gods. They washed and dressed divine statues. They offered food and drink. They treated gods as residents with very firm routines. It's not impossible that a ritual night occurred sometimes, in which a bed symbolized a union, or in which the statue of Marduk visited his consort, Sarpanatone. The city needed the gods to love each other. It's the kind of marriage everyone hopes their parents had, stably symbolic and entirely conducted above the living room. Let's move carefully to a clearer question. Were there sex workers in Mesopotamia? Of course, cities are complicated. Some ancient terms describe them. Haremtu, for example, seems to mean an independent sex worker, not a priestess, not a temple. Employee, just a person living in the city, with clients and an occupation. The line between sinner and artisan shifts depending on the tablet and the moral agenda of the scribe. Mesopotamia was not an enclave of modern sensibilities. It was a human place with human trades. But when kings came to the temple for rituals of union, they weren't dipping into a temple-managed roster. They were entering a story, one where the divine and the royal touched, and the land, astonishingly, was expected to notice. If you're still thinking about the Greek story, that grim queue in a temple courtyard, consider why it was appealing to repeat. It made the East lurid. It reassured Greek readers that their customs were superior. It also confused words. Greek writers used hierodalos, a temple slave or servant, to mean a person attached to a sanctuary. Some performed music, some wove, some poured beer, some carried offerings. Others were simply enslaved labor dedicated to a god, nothing more glamorous than sweeping floors. The Greek readers heard temple servant, saw a goddess associated with love, and connected the dots in a predictably male way. Meanwhile, the cuneiform tablets rolled their eyes. If tablets could roll anything and keep good records of barley rations, the kings, for their part, were not above letting foreign narratives hover. If people imagined the king had access to mysterious, sacred nights that didn't hurt, but the domestic reality was mostly choreographed symbolism. In some cities, a bed was set up in a shrine. A priestess and a king might share a cup, a litany, a moment that suggested union. In others, the entire act was purely divine, performed with statues and words. The city feasted. The farmers looked at the sky and calculated rainfall. The scribes wrote it all down because they always did, and the calendar clicked forward. Let's glance toward Assyria, where the goddess Ishtar-Inanna's northern accent had temples at Nineveh and Arbela. Assyrian kings were professional war enthusiasts. They loved inscriptions where they are both lions and gardeners. Because what is empire if not a slightly anxious man trying to be everything all the time? The kings prayed to Ishtar for victory. They described visions. They spoke of her as their fierce patroness. Ashurbanipal, the last great Assyrian king, and an enthusiastic literary hoarder, claimed intimate knowledge of the goddess's secrets. The texts do not imply ritualized, sacred prostitution. They imply a very intense spiritual alliance. Here's less romance and more war drum. Her favor confers conquest. Not necessarily cuddling, but even in Assyria, the royal women participated in cult life. Queens sponsored rituals. Some royal daughters became priestesses. It tethered the palace to the temples and the temples to the palace. Because in that world, separation of powers was a theory best left to philosophers not yet born. Perhaps the most instructive royal mishap in this whole area belongs to Nabonidus, last king of Babylon, who reigned in the 6th century BCE. Just before Cyrus the Persian went ahead and ended the entire Neo-Babylonian experiment, Nabonidus was different. He adored the moon god SPN, particularly the one worshipped at Haran in the far northwest. The gods in Babylon had a ranking system, like an office with nameplates, and Marduk was at the top. Nabonidus, however, spent years away from Babylon, in the oasis of Tima, supervising, building projects, and worshipping SPN like a devoted fan club president. He installed his daughter as high priestess of SPN at Euroclassic, moved to reinforce his religious agenda. It was clever and also exactly the sort of thing that made the Marduk priesthood get very tight around the jaw. The Akitu festival in Babylon suffered. The king's absence meant rituals weren't performed properly. The priests complained in tablets that read like a passive-aggressive HR memo. When Cyrus arrived, the priesthood helped him look like a savior. Divine legitimacy is not just incense and prayers. Nabonidus failed those. In that quieter failure, you can hear the logic of sacred marriage at work. The king must be present with the gods. His body, his voice, his tears even anchored the city's hopes. It's not the sex that matters, it's the scene. People need to watch their ruler plug himself into the sacred circuit. When he does, they exhale. When he doesn't, they look for a replacement with better temple manners. A little detour here. Through the domestic, kings had wives. They had official queens and unofficial ones. They had concubines who were sometimes diplomats in soft shoes. They had mothers who wrote steely about their dreams, like Adad Gupi, Nabonidus's mother, who claimed the moon god loved her life choices and promised to put her son on the throne, which he did. Kings had households like small cities, and yet a single ritual scene with a goddess could outshine all of that because it wasn't about love or progeny. It was about cosmic consent. The sacred marriage told the city, the gods approve this man. It's fine. Keep planting barley, please. When modern scholars picked up the old terms and translated them in the 19th century, they sometimes let the Greek rumor haunt their lexicons. Sacred prostitution became a neat label to stick on anything feminine, cultic, and not obviously married off to a local scribe. Later scholars, the ones who drink their tea and glare kindly at footnotes, have pushed back. Stephanie Boudin and others have argued at length that the whole concept as an institutional practice is a mirage. Not a single line in a roughly 8,000-year tradition, they say, describes temple-run sex for payment as part of goddess worship. Not one ledger's worth of fees. No list of client tokens. no complaint by a priest about a courtesan running late. Instead, what we have are liturgies of love and power. What we have is kings, hungry for the dignity of cosmic approval, staging nights in which gods and humans met on the level of symbol. And then, the next morning, going back to arguing about irrigation. There's a gentle irony here. The priestesses we can actually see most clearly in the records, the Nadru of Sippur, for instance, spent their lives in houses and courtyards, managing estates and suing neighbors over boundaries, stubbornly chased in a world that liked to imagine them otherwise. The Kadesta holy women float through ritual texts around Inanna as voices, singers, presence bearers, more akin to choirs than to anything the Greeks advertised. The temple economy was enormous, but it ran on grain, herd animals, textiles, and loans, not on coin, tossed at a woman waiting by a pillar. That particular pillar owes more to Herodotus's sense of drama than to the scribe's sense of accountancy. If we step back, slowly, as if into the cool air of a Mesopotamian night, we can look at what kings were really doing. They were building a narrative ecology. The city had fields and flocks. The gods had needs. The palace had ambition. The sacred marriage ritual stitched them. It told the farmer that the king's union with the goddess would make his furrows faithful. It told the warrior that Ishtar smiled, so victory might be possible without excessive stress. It told the scribe that everything could be measured and recorded, even the unmeasurable, which is a scribe's favorite game. The ritual itself in any given year might be simple: a hymn, a bed, a procession, a cup of beer shared between king and priestess. Or it might be more elaborate, with musicians, dancers, and the entire town pretending not to notice how nervous kings look when the gods are involved. Softly, Igativ, the ones who claimed the goddess's love sometimes had personal lives that were less poetry, more bureaucratic shambles. Shulgi bragged a lot, as men who build many buildings often do. Assyrian kings wrote of their victories with such fervor that you can hear the insomnia humming. Nabonidus took a long sabbatical to Arabia without clearing it with the city gods. And somewhere in all of this, there were marriages that were strategic and cold, children who were sickly and dynastic, plans that fell over at the worst possible moment because an airborne of a queen whose title was longer than a river choked on a fever. These were fragile houses, no matter how grand the walls, which is why a king would stand in a temple, let a priest slap his face, and hope for tears. He needed the city to believe that the world still held him up. If we were to watch from the edge of a courtyard late at night, we might see the ritual bed being sprinkled with water, the incense curling like a lazy snake, the priest speaking the names of Inanna with that deliberate slowness that tells the gods you are serious. We might see the king, not young, not old, wearing not his war helmet, but a circlet, stepping forward with the expression, men wear when they're about to do something embarrassing for reasons of state. We might see the high priestess, a woman with a royal nose and a mind for property disputes, reciting a hymn she has known since childhood, and then we would see less because the doors would close. What happens inside is the city's secret, or, more accurately, it's the city's story. It probably involved less than the Greeks imagined, and more than a cynical modern might allow. A union signaled, gestured toward, a cup shared, a blessing, and then dawn. The world still there, the barley still waiting, the canals still in need of scraping. The king would go back to the palace. The priestess would go back to the temple's residence, the jipper, the place of cool rooms and courtyards where the ledgers waited. The scribes would finalize the festival accounts, and life, which is to say politics, would grind on. As for the rumor of sacred prostitution, it would wander the centuries, gathering dust and scandal while the tablets quietly told another story. They told of kings who made love a metaphor because metaphors are easier to schedule than rain. They told of priestesses who balanced devotion with property management because that's what temples are, worship and administration. They told of rituals that reassured nervous populations with the softest of narratives. The gods love your king. The king loves the goddess. The land will respond in kind. It was fragile, and it worked until it didn't. But for a very long time, kept people sleeping at night, which, if we're honest, is what most state rituals are for. Let's drift, just for a moment, to how all this would feel. The new year. Festival, when the air cools and the year turns. The streets lit with oil lamps. The sound of drums, the low thud of a ballad instrument, a steady heartbeat for the city. The smell of beer and dates, baking bread and animal fat curling into smoke. The goddess's statue moving through the crowd on a litter, covered in fabrics, glittering with gold leaf that had been dutifully accounted for by a man who can list the weight of every thread. The king walking behind, not swaggering, no. He knows when to be humbling. The people watching, not in frenzy, but in that blank quiet that large groups can hold when they remember how small they are under the stars. The ritual is not about arousal. It's about rhythm. The rhythm of seed and harvest, of heat and frost, of hope and its small daily proofs. It is a city rocking itself to sleep with a story it loves, and that is not nothing. So how did Mesopotamian kings use sacred prostitution? They didn't, not in the tidy institutional sense the rumor suggests. They used sacred marriage. They used divine romance as a public utility. They used the language of love and union to tell their people that the cosmos consented. And sometimes, possibly, they stepped into a room with a bed and performed a quiet rite with a woman who represented a goddess and a city and the entire premise of civilization. The rite probably involved less than the scandalmongers hoped and more than the grumblers admitted. It certainly involved more accounting than anyone wants to imagine. And because kings are kings, they found ways to make it about them while pretending. It was about everyone. They whispered to the goddess that they were her shepherd, her sweet, her chosen one. They went home, wrote decrees, and tried to keep their families from imploding on schedule. Some succeeded, many did not, because ritual is strong. But dynasties are fragile, and the gods are inscrutable, and the Euphrates has moods. Let's drift over, when you're ready, to our next royal fiasco. But for now, keep the lights low. Let the city fall silent around us. Somewhere, a temple. Bed has been tidied, and the lamps have been snuffed. The night holds everything together. For a few hours more, let's drift from the mud-brick courtyards of Mesopotamia over to a river that behaves like a calendar. The Nile rises, everyone sighs, and the priests at dawn put on clean linen and their best expression of serene competence. Ease your breathing. Get comfortable. We're going to talk about purity and about what happens when human beings who do not excel at purity go to work in temples that demand it anyway. The Egyptians loved a rule. They shaved for it. They bathed for it. They wrote hymns about it. The daily temple, service awakening the god's statue. Bathing, dressing, perfuming, and feeding a tran on a schedule as strict as a railway. If the conductors had all sworn elaborate oaths to keep their hands astonishingly clean, priests abstained before service. No sex, no strong drink, no fish, shaved head to toe, fresh linen. The god appreciated order. Chaos was for stories, and naturally for foreign policy. So what happened when a rumor began, as rumors do, that a woman had seduced a priest? When the temple, the place of measured breath and polished floors, found itself wrapped in a bit of human complication. The awkward truth is that we don't have a single neat law labeled on the seduction of priests by women, 'cause ancient Egypt didn't publish legal codes in the Mesopotamian manner. No tablets that say Section 14b. If a woman coaxes a Wab priest behind the incense burner, do X. Instead, we have case fragments, temple rules embedded in ritual texts, petitions, wisdom literature, and the occasional explosion of outrage scratched onto astraca by people who very much wanted their neighbors punished. Out of that, a picture emerges not crisp, but good enough to see the outlines. And the outline says, it depended on where, when, and how public the scandal was, on whether it happened inside a sacred precinct, on whether it intersected with adultery, and on how much the priests wanted to make an example that week. Let's set the stage. Priests came in ranks. Wab priests, literally pure ones, handled day-to-day purity tasks. Higher ranks, God's fathers, prophets, oversaw liturgy. All had rules. Herodotus, our Greek travel writer, who never met an Egyptian habit he couldn't generalize, describes priests shaving every other day, bathing multiple times, and abstaining strictly before entering service. He has the tone of a man reluctantly impressed. And while Herodotus gets things wrong, when his curiosity runs ahead of his sources. Priestly purity is not a fantasy. Temple texts constantly rehearse it. Women were also in the temple, not as inadvertent chaos incarnate, but as part of the liturgy. Chantresses sang. Sistrum players shook bronze instruments to soothe the goddess. High status women, especially in Thebes, could carry the august titles God's Hand, Chief of the Music, and in a few periods, God's Wife of Amen, a political religious office with power, land, and ritual clout. So temples were not lonely clubs, were mixed spaces with strict boundary lines that could be crossed at the right times and never at the wrong ones. It's the never at the wrong ones that causes headaches. If a woman was accused of seducing a priest, the first question the temple would quietly ask itself is, did this make the god's house impure? If it happened in the sanctuary or on service days, it wasn't just a romantic lapse. It was ritual pollution. The Egyptians had a word for taboo TN. When that invisible tripwire snapped, the institution responded. What did that response look like? We can glimpse it in several ways. One set of clues comes from temple statutes and purity manuals from the late period, echoed in inscriptions at places like Edfu and Dendera. They do not read like law codes, but like meticulous job descriptions seasoned with threats. Don't eat this, don't drink that, don't touch that on those days. And under no circumstances turn the god's inner rooms into your private courtyard. Sexual activity within the sacred precinct is absolutely out. The penalty language, where it peeks through, tends to standard Egyptian punishments, beatings, fines, dismissal from office, and banishment from the temple. 100 blows and 5 wounds is the formula you meet over and over in Egyptian. Punitive texts a way of saying a serious beating, plus cuts to remind you that you made bad choices. It's not specific to seduction. It shows up for theft, disorder, extortion. But when temple rules talk punishment, they reach for that formula. It's their go-to THUNDERCLAP. A second set of clues comes from everyday court records and community life at Deir el Medina, the village of royal tomb workers in the New Kingdom, where people wrote down everything. They recorded adultery accusations with the vigor of a neighborhood council that really cares about everyone else's business. The community's handling of adultery ranged from divorce and property rearrangements to public beatings and expulsion from the village. Lovers might be flogged. Women might be sent back to their families with dowry adjustments. Was involved, his professional life suffered. He could be suspended from service, barred from entering the temple for a set period, and fined. The woman, unless she was a temple functionary herself, was usually processed through the civil lens of adultery and domestic disruption, not a bespoke seduction of priest category. And this is where the Egyptian approach starts to look like the thing it always is: pragmatic. The priest's purity was his responsibility. If he slipped, he bore the ritual consequence. The woman bore the social one. Neither walked away unscathed. Neither was necessarily destroyed. You can hear the bureaucracy sighing. Keep the gods. Rooms clean. Keep the households from open warfare. And move on. If, however, the line crossed wasn't just ritual, but political, everything changed. You can see this in the famous harem conspiracy against Ramesses III at the end of the 20th dynasty. It wasn't about priests caught in a side chamber, but it involved women of the royal household accused of manipulating officials and using magic love spells included for treasonous ends. The judicial papyrus of Turin lists multiple defendants, including women, tried in separate courts. The punishments were severe, execution in various forms, forcing some to take their own lives. In other cases, mutilation ears and noses cut, off-branding dishonor on the face. Different crime, same mechanism. When sexual manipulation crossed into sacrilege against the state, the hammer fell hard. That magnitude is rare. Most Egyptian discipline lives in the middle register. Humiliating, painful, administrative. The temple is not a courtroom with black robes and polished speeches. It's a machine designed to maintain rightness. If the machine stutters, out come the rods, the fines, and the paperwork. Everyone learns the lesson. Everyone continues in their role, if possible. One more angle matters. Where did the alleged seduction happen? The Egyptians took space seriously. The inner sanctuary was the gods. The outer courts were more permeable. The priest's house was his house, not the temple's. If the gossip pinned the encounter to a forbidden space or moment inside, the wabbit, the pure place, or before dawn service on a day of abstinence, temple authorities had grounds to make it a temple case. Not just a domestic scandal. Penalties would emphasize ritual pollution, ritual purification, extra days of abstinence, fines paid to the temple, and exclusion from certain rites for a set time. If it happened off-site, the matter drifted toward civil resolution of wars, compensation, perhaps a local court standard, flogging for public nuisance. What about the women, actually, within the temple system, chantresses, musicians, administrators who were accused? Here, the stakes were sharper. A woman holding a temple title was part of the sacred labor force. If she scandalized the precinct, she could lose her office and its income. Temple property and rations were serious business. Titles like Shemayet, singer, or Ayet, sistra, player, came with very literal pay. Stripping them wasn't just shaming, it was economic punishment. We see analogous measures for men removed from priesthoods after misbehavior. Their names vanish from rosters. Their shares of offerings go to someone else. Their sons find their expected ladder missing a rung. Egypt punished status by quietly erasing it. It's effective. It also looks good on papyrus. Then there's Thebes, where, from the third intermediate period through the late period, the god's wife of Ammon became a cornerstone of politics. She was a royal daughter or noble woman of staggering prestige, nominally celibate, with a staff of female officials and close collaboration with male priests. Her body was not just personal, it was an instrument of state religion. Had touched that office, it would have been catastrophic. We have no record of such a case, which tells you two things. Either it didn't happen, or if it did, the archives sat on it like a hippo on a reed mat. The priesthood had every reason to keep the image of that office immaculate. Accusations of seducing priests. You have to see how carefully the system insulated its top women from both temptation and rumor. They lived in guarded precincts. They managed estates through stewards. They adopted heirs rather than producing them. It was administrative celibacy, and it kept Thebes stable if you count politically useful stagnation as a kind of stability, which the 25th and 26th dynasty rulers certainly did. Let's drift back down into the texture of punishment. Beatings were not improvisational. The 100 blows, 5 wounds formula appears in decrees and records like the Edict of Horemheb, a late 18th dynasty text that, among other things, threatens colonels and scribes who prey on civilians with spectacularly unpleasant days. Horemheb, Egypt's tidy-up king after the Amarna turmoil, was a man with a list and a pen, and he meant to get through both. The 5 wounds were slashes, usually administered to mark a crime indelibly. It was a way of saying, this person broke trust, which is what impurity is in Egyptian thought, a breach in trust with the gods. Repeat offenders could be banished from certain spaces. That last penalty banishment is especially temple-flavored. There's nothing like being told you can no longer approach the God you served to make a person feel small and noticed. What about more spectacular punishments? Nose cutting, ear cutting, branding, those appear in the Egyptian toolkit. But they are not thrown around lightly. They attach to treason, tomb robbery, and state-level sacrilege. A garden variety, seduction, even when it embarrassed a temple, wouldn't usually qualify for facial renovations. The Egyptians were conservative with mutilation. You can feel the administrative voice in the background. Let's keep the face intact and the schedules unchanged. It's also worth pausing over the idea of seduction itself. Egyptian texts, wisdom literature, love poetry do not imagine women as seduction machines and men as helpless reeds. They are frankly articulate about mutual desire. The love poems are sweet and earthy. The wisdom texts warn men not to break houses by chasing other men's wives. The burden of restraint lies on the individual, not on a demonized temptress. When a priest fell short, the official language tended to put responsibility on the priest's failure to maintain purity, not on the woman's inherent wickedness, which is not to say women escaped censure. They didn't, but the conceptual framework is different from those later legal systems that invented wild categories like bewitching a monk. Gyp thought the problem was order, not womanhood. That said, reputation mattered. A woman labeled disruptive around a temple would find doors closing. Temples were major employers and landlords. They rented houses, leased fields, allocated grain. Being on the wrong side of their goodwill was economically miserable. A priest, even shamed, might return after a period of purification. A woman, without a temple title, might just be frozen out. No more singing work at festivals. No more access to the inner courts on Hathric feast days. And a husband, if she had one, who decided this was the moment to revise the marriage contract in his favor, because yes, Egypt had marriage contracts. Not for everyone, all the time, but often enough that we have lots. They spelled out property, dowry, what happens if someone walks out, and what happens if someone behaves badly. In the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, these contracts get wonderfully fussy Greek and demotic pages of if X, then Y, with penalties for adultery measured in silver or grain. These penalties fall equally on men and women in the text, which is charming. In practice, power always slants. But they let us see how accusations of seduction would resolve when the priestly angle was just the garnish with enumerated fines, transfers of property, and a very cold household. What if it was the woman of the temple, say, a chantress accused of drawing a priest into impurity? There's a good chance her colleagues handled it first. Temples were bureaucratic hives. They had rosters, superintendents, the ancient world's most committed HR. Internal discipline was faster and more thorough than dragging everything to a public court. You can almost hear the quiet meeting in a side chamber, the superior woman, with the sistrum, 2 senior priests, the accused, a scribe. The result? Loss of rations for a month, removal from service for a festival cycle. A note on a list that will be read aloud later in a tone that makes everyone uncomfortable. That's how order likes to fix itself quietly, with a pin, is there. Any spectacular case of a woman seducing a priest and getting, say, thrown to crocodiles. That story is what Greeks and later writers like to imagine about foreign places. Colorful punishments for colorful sins. Egypt's gods, occasionally, sport crocodile heads, but they do not run a crocodile court. What we actually see in the sources is men and women negotiating consequences through established, dull mechanisms. Beatings calibrated by number and wound. Banishments measured by gate and threshold. Fines counted in deben of copper or kite. Of silver, and marriages renegotiated with witnesses who are always named and always somehow relatives. One last, quiet irony. Priests themselves left autobiographies and pious stele extolling their purity. I was pure, I napped in the temple only after abstinence. I did not approach women on service days. A bit of preemptive reputation laundering in stone. The genre is telling. Men assured the gods and posterity they did not slide, which suggests the possibility was vivid enough to warrant denial. In those carved lines, you hear the human condition humming. Temptation exists. Therefore, I must say, I resisted it. Whether anyone believed them is another question. Stone is persuasive. Gossip is more so what happened to women accused of seducing priests in Egypt. Often, nothing cinematic. If it touched the temple, expect temple discipline, beatings for public disorder, exclusion from sacred space, removal from temple payrolls, and ritual penalties for the priest abstinence, purification, suspension. Expect divorce, fines, and the domestic chessboard resetting itself. If it touched the state in the teeth of a conspiracy, expect sharpness, mutilation, forced death, and names excised with the steady hand of a chisel. The system tended toward continuity. It liked its priests groomed, and its scandals resolved on paper. And because our theme is always elites behaving like anxious mortals, spare a moment for the highborn women wrapped in glory and caution in Thebes, the gods' wives of Ammon, who were meant to be all presence and no progeny. They kept their status by not being part of any story like this. Their lives were a long, ceremonial sidestep around the ordinary traffic of human mess. That tidiness, you will have noticed by now, is maybe the most Egyptian punishment of all, being trapped in perfection. Good for politics, less entertaining for the sleep-deprived. Let's drift forward gently to the next royal miscalculation. Waiting in the dark. The lamps are low. The river keeps time. Somewhere, a scribe is finishing a note about fines and wounds, and closing his box of reeds with the satisfied air of a man who has restored order for tonight. Let's drift down to a lean, stony corner of the Greek world, where the nights were quiet, the talk was scarce, and the neighbors judged you entirely by your calf muscles. This is Sparta, of course, where the men tried to behave like iron, and the women were politely expected to produce it. If your lights are dim and your blanket is friendly, we'll keep it soft. We're going to talk about how Spartans handled relationships outside marriage, which is to say, how a society that claimed to hate luxury made an exception for the oldest luxury of all, other people. The first thing to understand is that the Spartans built their public image like a wall. Straight lines, hard angles, no frills. Inside the wall, things were less tidy. They usually are. The system put the state's needs in front of personal ones, which made love a civil servant. Marriage existed, of course, but it was drafted. Its job was to make more Spartans, ideally sturdy ones, and not to distract soldiers from dinner with their mess group. Because, in Sparta, you ate with your comrades, not with your spouse. That's how romance becomes logistics. Let's start with how Spartan marriage began, because it sets the tone. Plutarch, a writer who adored anecdotes like a cat adores boxes, tells us that a Spartan wedding looked suspiciously like a small weekday kidnapping. The bride's head was shaved. She was dressed in a man's cloak and sandals and laid on a pallet in a dark room. The groom came secretly at night, without witnesses, and left before dawn. And he did this for a while, sometimes for years, before anyone admitted they were a boring married couple. It's theater, really, with a moral. Men should not become too attached. Women should be sturdy. Desire should be fed like a wild animal you're trying to domesticate occasionally. without eye contact. Husbands didn't spend their evenings at home. Adult men ate in the messes, the secessia, with their assigned group, where conversation was light, food was lighter, and the point was discipline. They slept at home eventually, after 30, mostly, but the habit of a marriage in fragments lingered. It's not a recipe for affairs, exactly. It's a recipe for a city where the state has a hand on every shoulder and a whisper in every ear. If anyone was going to decide how your intimate life worked, it was going to be the Constitution, or at least the men who claimed to remember what Lycurgus would have said if he'd stuck around. So how did Spartans handle affairs outside marriage? With what looks like a contradiction. Unless you remember the one rule Sparta never breaks. Whatever makes more good citizens is moral. Whatever doesn't is not. If an arrangement increased healthy births among full citizens, everyone sighed in approval and called it virtue. If it threatened a household's line or the state's neat social pyramid, it was a scandal. Simple, not kind, but simple. The classical sources Xenophon and Plutarch especially give us the outlines. Xenophon admired Sparta. He wrote a whole little book about its customs, a pamphlet of praise disguised as a manual. In it, he drops a few lines that sound almost modern and almost monstrous, depending on your angle and your bedtime. He says that if an older man married a young woman, and if he worried that his age would make children unlikely, it was considered respectable to invite a younger, admirable man to visit her and help. He also says that if a man admired another man's wife for her good sense and strong body, Spartan compliments at their finest, he could ask the husband for permission to have children with her. The husband might agree if he liked the man and the idea of more good citizens. Plutarch echoes the point and adds the little shrug that Spartans love to offer. Jealousy is for people who can afford it. Was this common? We can't measure. The sources are light on data. Sparta was a closed club, and the paperwork isn't generous. But the permission existed. It had a rationale, flooding the city with quality offspring without burdening marriages with sentiment. In practice, it meant that extramarital sex could be not only acceptable, but applaudable, if arranged with consent, discretion, and a civic smile. Affairs? Not the right word. These were assignments. It's worth pausing on what this means for women. Spartan women had more visibility and property than most Greek women. They trained physically running, wrestling, and throwing things without asking anyone for a note. They managed households, while men did military errands. By the Hellenistic period, women held a shocking proportion of land. Plutarch says 2/5 thanks to dowries, inheritances, and a pipeline of men who died inconveniently. So, a Spartan wife was not invisible. And when men arranged procreative borrowings, she wasn't a silent doorway. She had to agree, at least publicly. The state didn't announce a coercion policy. It announced a fertility policy dressed as virtue. Consent is a complicated word in a society that trains you to love obedience. But even within that, Spartan women approached these arrangements with agency that often surprises modern readers, especially when compared to Athens, where the wife was an indoor appliance with legal attachments. Polyandry also has a cameo. Several reports tell us that in Sparta, one woman could be the wife of more than one man, especially brothers. This was not a romantic experiment. It kept the states undivided, ensured a line of heirs, and reduced the number of dowries, sparking family budget meetings. In other words, the city accepted a kind of planned multi-husband situation when it was tidy and helpful. Affairs? Again, not quite. More a filing system now. If you're feeling the prickly question, you're not alone. What about adultery moiata, the classic Greek scandal of a man in another man's house? In Athens, this was a theater of outrage. Laws screamed, plays cackled. At Sparta, enforcement looks like a shrug paired with a checklist. The husband's consent was the dividing line. With it, the act could be honorable. Without it, the city didn't flip a table. It simply recognized a disorder, a threat to paternity certainty, and moved to tidy it up. We don't have a Spartan law code spelling out penalties because the Spartans didn't publish their rules on stone like a self-conscious democracy would. But the pattern is clear enough from the stories. Unwanted entanglements produced social punishments, shaming, exclusion from certain privileges, damage to the man standing at his mess, and damage to the woman's marriage prospects. In the rare case where the scandal reached the royal house, things became predictably political and predictably messy. Q1 of the strangest royal fiascos in Spartan history, delivered with the gentle bow we reserve for cautionary tales. King Aegeus II had a wife named Timea. She was not discreet, or perhaps she was indiscreet, very intentionally. While Aegeus was away doing what Spartan kings do, marching purposefully and frowning, Timea had an affair with the most chaotic man. In Greece, Alcibiades, the dazzling, disastrous Athenian who could charm a temple column, betray a city before lunch, and still get invited to dinner. Plutarch says to Timea, "Let it be known that her son, Leotychides, was Alcibiades' child," because of course she did. Naturally, they made it worse. When succession time came, Leotychides claimed the throne. Spartan kingship liked clarity. Two royal houses, the Agiads and the Eurypontids, each producing a king. Paternity doubt was dynamite. The EFRS, the Spartan officials who specialized in frowning in comitia, ruled that Leotychides was illegitimate. The crown went to Aegis's half-brother, shorter than average, but very convenient in paperwork. Leotychides was sent off to exile with the look of a man who regrets his mother's storytelling. So, here is your Spartan rule in practice. The state would tolerate flexible arrangements to make more Spartans. It would not tolerate a rumor that unseated a dynasty. Affairs were administrative until they were treason. Then they were fatal. It wasn't the only royal oddity. An earlier king, Anaxandrides II had the kind of household that would make a modern genealogist roll their eyes and open a second browser tab. He married as kings do. No children arrived. The Ephors suggested a divorce. Anaxandrides, to his credit or his stubbornness, refused. He liked his wife. The Ephors, always pragmatic, allowed him to take a second wife while keeping the first an open, state-sanctioned bigamy. The second wife gave him Cleomenes. The first, in a move that must have made every F4 stare fixedly at a wall, then produced 3 sons in quick succession. Dorius, Leonidas. Yes, that Leonidas and Cleombrotus. Later, the half-brothers' rivalries helped push Darius into sulking adventures abroad and cleared the path for Leonidas to become the world's favorite doomed motivational poster. That entire chain of events began with a man who wouldn't divorce a council that allowed 2 wives, and the remarkable fertility of someone the bureaucracy had already labeled barren. Extramarital arrangements were not incidental in Sparta. Sometimes they were the hinge of history. Beyond the palaces and their headaches, the city had a persistent problem. Not enough Spartans. War, discipline, and the cheerful habit of kicking people out for failing standards did their work. Numbers fell. Aristotle, who never missed a chance to scold a constitution, pointed out in later centuries that Sparta had far too few full citizens for comfort, and that women held too much property to keep the citizen body alive. The Spartans leaned harder on arrangements. Young bachelors were nudged to stop being picky. Men with prestige were asked, implicitly or explicitly, to distribute their genes with civic-minded generosity. These were not secret affairs. They were policies with a human face. Stories drift in from the foggier edges of memory. The Parthenai, sons of maidens, who were said to be born to unmarried Spartan women during wartime, then bundled off to found a colony at Taurus Tarentum in southern Italy because their status didn't fit neatly in the homeland. The details vary and the sources are late, but the moral is consistent. Sparta could tolerate unusual procreation when it suited the demographic spreadsheet. It just preferred not to look at the children while doing it. Another facet that soothes. Spartan headaches. The agoge, the education system that made boys into citizen soldiers and made men into people who could walk silently for miles without eating a snack. Alongside physical training came mentorships with older men. The Greeks loved a vocabulary for the Sarists and Arminos, lovers and beloveds, but the Spartan sources insist, rather primly, that the relationship was about education and virtue, not sex. Xenophon dodges the question with the energy of a man refusing to get into specifics. Plutarch says that sexual intimacy between men was discouraged or punished, and that the love in question was meant to be the kind that admires a soul and coaches a future hoplite. Whether Spartans always obeyed the rule is another matter. Humans are as they are, even in a city that tried to make them otherwise. Still, the official posture matters. Illicit sex was not the point. If a relationship improved a boy's chances of becoming a disciplined citizen, it was praised. If it devolved into indulgence, it was cut off at the knees, often literally in the form of public shaming and loss of standing. Even outside marriage, intimacy had to pass the citizenship test. What about Helletsta, unfree laborers who kept the fields running while Spartans posed as minimalists? The sources are grim and incomplete. There's no neat manual on Helute-Spartiate relations, because the Spartans were not keen on writing one. There were likely illegitimate children from liaisons between Spartiate men and Helot women. The social categories, mothakes, and other near-citizen types appear, shadowy at the edges of the class system. The state's response was not romantic. These children could be trained, sometimes freed and attached to the army or shipped into a social corner where they existed usefully and not quite fully. Here, again, anything that could be bent into the service of the state was bent, and anything that threatened the clean citizen line was sent away to be someone else's problem. As for daily management of extramarital behavior among ordinary citizens, the toolkit was Spartan in both senses, minimal and pointed. A man caught courting a woman in a way that ignored the husband's consent would be shamed. Shaving the mustache always, a popular Greek punishment, might be involved. Public ridicule definitely was. Spartans loved mockery when a sermon wouldn't do. A woman who developed a reputation for disorder would find her prospects squeezed. Fewer invitations to the festivals, where women danced in front of the gods and everyone took mental notes. Fewer husbands willing to overlook whispers. More family. Meetings where uncles made comments like, "We are not Athenians, my dear," which is a very Spartan way of saying, "Stop it." The mess groups were excellent rumor networks. A man who embarrassed his mess paid for it, sometimes with fines, sometimes with the kind of ritual cold shoulder that turns dinner into a moral parable. It was social correction with spears stacked neatly in the corner. And then there's the small paradox that Spartans talked in circles around. They prized self-control, but they also prized the kind of boldness that gets you into the bed of the king's wife if you happen to be Alcibiades. The difference, again, was whether the act served the state. Alcibiades did not. Agesilaus, short and competent, did, which is how you get a city where polyandry can be respectable, wife-sharing can be virtuous, and a rumor at the palace can screen out an heir. The rules were elastic, but always stretched in one direction. The dryness of the system is its own comedy. Xenophon writes as if he's telling you how to run a kennel for well-bred hounds. Pair the best with the best. Reduce fuss, praise obedience. Plutarch gives you theatrical anecdotes: brides with shaved heads, husbands creeping at midnight, wives lent out like prized broodmares, with that tone of antique amusement. Neither man thinks he's describing passion. He's describing engineering. The Spartans saw the household as a machine for producing citizens, and the bedroom as a part to be greased on schedule, not embellished with curtains. But people are people, which means even in Sparta, someone pined, someone sulked, someone wrote a little song that didn't survive because the archivists were bored. Love finds its way around systems. It almost certainly did in Laconia. We just lacked the poems, and that may be the most Spartan thing of all. So, you're drifting towards sleep and wondering how to file all this. Spartans handled affairs outside marriage by converting them into policy. They allowed, even encouraged, arrangements that created more full citizens, husband-approved procreation with admirable men, occasional polyandry to keep estates intact, carefully managed bigamy in royal emergencies. They discouraged anything that muddled paternity or damaged the tidy line of inheritance. They punished disorder with social tools, ridicule, exclusion, the gentle but relentless pressure of a dinner table gone cold. And when politics was at stake, they hardened quickly. The Otakitas learned that the hard way. Lysibiades would have smiled and then asked for wine. The result is a society that dressed discipline in every room, even the private ones. Secrets existed, but only until they touched the state. Then they were turned into precedent. Like Kyrgyzstan, he existed as a single person and not as a comforting legend would have approved. He believed people should be useful. The Spartans simply made desire report for duty. Let's glide on, then toward the next dynastic oddity, waiting patiently in another century. For now, keep the night quiet. Imagine the messes settling down, the last conversations fading. Somewhere, a husband is pulling on his sandals in the dark, stepping carefully back to his comrades, leaving a wife who will be measured, like everything else, by the children she brings and the silence she keeps. The city breathes. It likes its order. It will make exceptions when it must, and it will never admit it enjoyed them. Let's drift over to Athens on a warm night, where the streets are dusty, the wine is diluted just enough to make everyone claim it isn't, and the men excel at speeches that last longer than a harvest. Get comfortable. Let the hum fall to a low murmur. We're going to talk about the women who entered those men's rooms openly, not as wives, but as companions. The hetairai. The word means companions, which is already a hint. Not wives. Not girls bought by the hour at the cheap house. By the gate, companions, in a city that pretended companionship was a mal-lonely sport. Athens liked tidy categories, at least on paper. The famous line, preserved in a courtroom speech and repeated forever because it's tidy, goes like this. We have hetairai for pleasure, Palachai concubines for daily bodily needs, and wives to bear legitimate children and run the household. It's blunt. It's also a performance for the jury. But buried in the bluntness is the city's triangle. The wife lives at home, legal and necessary. The common sex worker, porn keeps the market satisfied and the law less nervous. And the hetairai, somewhere in the middle, educated enough to talk, expensive enough to avoid crowds, and visible enough to make a politician sweat. Let's meet them slowly, without the scandal first. A hetairai in Athens was usually a foreign-born woman, a medic, sometimes a freed woman, sometimes still technically enslaved by a discreet manager. She paid medic tax, needed a male guardian to represent her in court, and could not marry a citizen as a citizen wife after the 5th century law narrowed citizenship to children of 2 citizen parents. All the legal doors were politely shut, and yet she might dine with the men who wrote those laws, laughing into her cup while they explained principles they rarely followed. What did she do that a wife did not? She went out. She attended symposia, the after-dinner drinking parties, where men sang, argued, and abolished the laws for fun. She danced if she wanted to. She played the flute if she had trained as an allotress, which made her more musician than conversationalist. At the higher Enhetira, in the narrower sense, she was there to talk, to be witty, to flatter and cut, to steer a conversation, which is a way of steering a network. If you want to measure soft power, count invitations. Athens famously kept reputable wives indoors. The oikos, the household, was their world. Weaving rooms, storerooms, children, servants. A wife's virtue was a kind of invisibility cloak. Meanwhile, the city put nearly all its political oxygen into rooms where wives never sat: the assembly, the law courts, the symposia. Tiri moved in that oxygen. That was the opening. The names that float to the top are the ones that wrote themselves into stories, either because they earned it or because men decided they looked good in a speech. Aspasia, Theodote, Phryne, Neaera, Lais, each comes with a beam of candlelight and a chorus of caveats. Our sources are male, smug, and fond of a good jab. Orators slander for a living. Comedians do it for art. Philosophers do it with a straight face and claim it's a thought experiment. So we sift. Aspasia of Miletus is the one Athens can't stop rehearsing. She was foreign. She lived with Pericles, the first citizen of the city, the man whose name clings to a whole era like incense. She was said to run a house where other companions lived and learned, which sounds like either entrepreneurship or a slander designed to make her brilliance legible to a jury. The comedians called her a whore because comedians call everyone something. The philosophers credited her with rhetoric. One Platonic dialogue, Menexenos, cheekily attributes a funeral oration to Aspasia, as if to say the city's finest words might come from a woman you won't admit to the assembly. Socratic writings outside Plato go further. Aeschines, not the orator. The Socratic makes Aspasia the instructor of men in household management and public persuasion, which is either a tribute or a mirror held up to Athens, depending on your patience. Did Aspasia wield power? Not by vote, but she moved men who did. Pericles proposed the citizenship law that tightened the gate. Later, after plague took his legitimate sons, he sought a special decree to legitimate his son by Aspasia. The assembly softened by pity, loyalty, or the storm of death around them agreed. This is not dissolving statutes with a smile. It's a slow, heavy fact. The law bent because Pericles asked, and he asked because his domestic life required it. Aspasia, who couldn't enter the assembly, rippled it anyway. There's also the rumor of a prosecution. Aspasia, charged with impiety, Pericles defending her, tears included. Plutarch tells that one collecting gossip alongside dates like a good biographer. We can't verify it. Comedy had already made Aspasia a public target. A sycophant could have easily turned jokes into an indictment. Whether it happened or not matters less than why it was told. The story assumes she was visible enough to prosecute and valuable enough for Pericles to risk crying in court. In Athens, being the reason a man breaks his posture is a form of power. It isn't gracious. It is real. Aspasia wasn't the only woman philosophers found instructive. Xenophon introduces us to Theodote, a hetaira, whose house Socrates casually visits, as if to examine her like a craftsman with a product. They speak politely about marketing. Theodote complains that lovers drift away. Socrates suggests she'll cultivate friends, create obligations, and use kindness as a net advice, thick with irony. Since most men in Athens received similar training from their mothers and then pretended they didn't, the point is less Theodote's biography than her position. She is running a business that depends on reputation, negotiation, and repeat customers who happen to be men who legislate. If Socrates thought her worth visiting, she inhabited the same rhetorical space he did. The city's ongoing conversation. Neaera brings another register of power. The courtroom kinda had the price of it. The speech called against Neaera is a small novel of a life told as evidence. The speaker, likely Apollodorus, traces Neaera from girlhood, sold to a brothel keeper who trained courtesans. Through her years, touring the circuit of dinner parties, to her eventual relationship with a man named Stephanus in Athens. The core allegation is not that Neaera slept with men. That was obvious, and to be honest, not illegal. The core is that she and Stephanus tried to pass her off as a citizen wife, and her daughter as a citizen daughter, to secure a marriage and inheritance. Privileges that crossed a bright line. The speech is full of spice, partly to entertain jurors, partly to make a legal point feel like moral work. Whether Neaera was convicted is unknown. The atmosphere of the case we can measure. A hetaira could be lavishly connected and still perilously exposed if she brushed against citizen identity. The law did not care about silver cups and famous friends when it came to the citizen register. Power, in her case, was precarious and personal. It protected her until it didn't. Fran Thespia's Golden Rumor shows us the spectacle version. Later writers, especially Athenias, collecting gossip with scholarly glee, tell us that Phryne was astonishingly beautiful, rich, and clever. She was the companion of the sculptor Praxiteles, and supposedly the model for his Aphrodite haps. Knidos, perhaps not. Attribution drifts like perfume. She was prosecuted for impiety. Hyperides defended her. In the theatrical version of the story, he bared her breast to the jurors to remind them that whoever made this body must be close to the gods. The jury acquitted. It is very likely a rhetorical fable. Orators loved to imagine arguments so persuasive that physics bent, but the fable grew because something in it rang true. Phryne was significant enough that a charge against her became a referendum on judgment and beauty. She made dedications. She traveled. She negotiated fees that outlived the night. There's even a tall tale that she offered to rebuild the walls of Thebes if they inscribed her name on them. Thebes famously humorless when Macedon was done with. It declined. The point is hardly whether she held a trowel. It's that men thought it plausible she could. Lays of Corinth, maybe two women with one name, which never helps the minutes, belongs to the same. Constellation, expensive, sought by famous men who liked to be seen asking. One story says she charged Demosthenes a breathtaking fee that he declined, only to be mocked for valuing his rhetoric more than pleasure. It reads like a joke, written by a rival so average Athenian content. But again, the shape is familiar. Courtesans as arbiters of male status. If Lays turned you down, she condensed your inadequacies into a proverb. That's influence, the kind that doesn't need a vote because it has a better instrument. Humiliation. How in this world did Hetairai actually wield power? Not by edict, by being the one person in a room who could speak to every man there without pretending she wanted a new rug. Consider the symposium. The law was not made at symposia, unless you count the law of one more song. But alliances, where speakers tried out arguments, friends were baked, enemies softened and hardened again, depending on the dilution ratio. The Hetairai in the corner seat heard what no wife heard, who loathed whom, who was vulnerable, whose latest law had bored even his cousin. She could tease a man who lacked friends and praise a man who needed it, doing small things that move larger ones' introductions, reconciliations, embarrassments. The skill set was old. Listen more than you speak. Speak when it matters. It sounds suspiciously like politics. There is also the economy. High-end Hetairai controlled their fees, chose their clients, and built nests of gifts, jewelry, and property transferred by clever means to dodge the walls of Medic law. They could manumit themselves, if enslaved, sponsor small dedications that wrote their names in stone, and fund younger women as they had been funded chaperoning a new generation into the old game. When a woman like Aspasia appears as mentor in the sources, you're seeing a business model. When a woman like Neaera is accused of being passed between owners like a fine vase, you're seeing the same model without the varnish. Structure is the same. The performers change. The law both framed and limited their reach. Athens was not squeamish about sex so much as it was obsessed with citizen purity. Moichai adultery was an injury against a citizen household. Touching a citizen's wife was chaos, and the law authorized outrage accordingly. But with Hetairai, the city was calmer. A man could visit. He could pay. He could even keep a long relationship. He just could not attach the privileges of citizen marriage to it. The line was bright. Men crossed it only when grief, love, or politics made them reckless. That's when the orators rolled out the rhetoric and the clerks sharpened their stay. In that bright line is the edge of Hetera power. They could bend taste, hairstyles, perfume, witty turns that later wives tried on at New Year feasts. They could bend culture, muses for artists, models for sculptors, fodder for comedians who owed them a check. They could occasionally bend policy, as Aspasia seems to have done by simply existing in Pericles' house and raising questions the law wasn't built to answer. But they could not hold office, vote, or pass property to citizen sons. Their power was intimate, situational, and famously deniable, which is to say, real and forever vulnerable to the morning after. If you're thinking that Athens resented this, you're listening closely. The city liked to imagine its men as self-contained. To admit influence from a woman without a legal last name was to admit that human beings are porous. So it called Hetairai dangerous and then sent for them at 10. It wrote laws to keep them out of the assembly and then quoted their jokes in the assembly. It prosecuted Neaera to defend the citizen body and then applauded plays that displayed courtesans as the only clear-sighted people on stage. Double standards weren't a bug. They were the entertainment. A few more quiet vignettes round out the picture. There's a small story about Praxiteles and Phryne, recorded by later writers. She asked him which of his works he valued most. He dodged. She arranged a mock fire at his workshop, shouted for the assistants to save his arrows, revealing his favorite. It reads like a parable about persuasion, the kind Hetairai practiced better than statesmen. Ask, and if the man lies, set a tiny, unthreatening blaze under his vanity and see what he saves. It's charming and probably invented, which, in Athens, is the same as true in the moral sense. There's also the afterlife of these women in memory. Hetairai show up on painted vases, dancing or lounging at symposia with the kind of easy body language wives never get in art. They appear in inscriptions here and there, usually as dedicatees or dedicators, slipping their names into the cities. Stone whisper. They haunt the orations as warnings and counterexamples. If you make a list of moments when Athenians wrestled out loud with what kind of men they wanted to be, there's usually a hetaira just off stage. Pouring wine. So, who were the Hetairan? How did they wield power? They were companions in a world built to exclude women from companionship. They used talk, timing, gifts, and the careful management of attention to navigate that world's richest rooms. They curated their clientele, invested their earnings, protected their names when they could, and gambled them when they must. They were disdained publicly and needed privately. They were praised as witty by the same pens that called them corrupting. They were made up by comedians and then blamed for being myths. Their power was the softest kind, the one that makes a man think he thought of something himself. And because Athens loved irony as much as it loved itself, one of its most famous leaders built a law that kept such women outside the citizen body, then begged an exception because grief made him smaller than the law, and love made him ask. The city granted it. Ahetira won nothing formal by that act. She won something else, the outline of her presence in the official minutes, not a vote, a shadow in the assembly's light. That is often how power first appears, as a rumor, as a story, as a woman laughing gently at a joke she's already heard, and steering the evening 1 degree to the left. Let's drift onward soon, to another court, another dynasty, another imbalance, pretending it isn't. For now, imagine the last song at a symposium, the cups set down, the doors opening onto a street that never really sleeps. Somewhere, a woman counts the evenings. Silver smiles at the thought of a well-timed remark and blows out the lamp. The city will keep talking in the morning. She will be ready.